January 1944. A frozen night in the American Midwest. Floodlights carve pale cones through falling snow, glinting off the barbed wire of a German prisoner of war camp. Inside, men in tattered field coats shuffle toward the mess hall, their breath rising in white ghosts. The war is thousands of miles away, yet its echoes linger. Boots scuffing on ice, murmurs in a language once feared. A U.S. guard steps forward, holding something small in his gloved hand, a square of Hershey's chocolate. He calls out a name in clear, perfect German. Feldwebel Hans Kruger. The prisoner freezes. No one here was supposed to know his name, his rank, his mother tongue. He nods slowly. The guard smiles, a brief human gesture, and presses the chocolate into his palm. Kruger stares down at it. For the first time in years, he tastes sweetness. His eyes fill. He turns away, ashamed of his tears. It was a single moment, one of thousands, when Germany's sons discovered that their enemy could also be merciful. The road to that night began long before, across oceans and battlefields. By 1942, the tide of the Second World War had begun to turn. In North Africa, the Africa Corps was being squeezed between the British Eighth Army under Montgomery and the newly reinforced American forces advancing from Morocco and Algeria. Across the deserts, in Tunisia's blazing heat, tens of thousands of German and Italian soldiers were encircled and forced to surrender. For the Allies, the victory was strategic. For the United States, it posed a logistical question few had anticipated: what to do with nearly 250,000 enemy prisoners. The Geneva Convention of 1929 dictated that prisoners of war must be treated humanely, fed, housed, and protected from violence or humiliation. America, still finding its moral footing in a global war, decided to do something remarkable. It would obey the law to the letter. The first large groups of German POWs arrived on U.S. soil in the summer of 1943. They came in Liberty ships that had once carried tanks and ammunition to Europe, returning across the Atlantic filled instead with defeated men. When the hatches opened in New York, Norfolk, and New Orleans, the prisoners blinked at a country untouched by bombers. Clean streets, full shops, smiling civilians. They were then divided and sent inland. Camps began appearing across the American heartland, from dusty Arizona to frozen Wisconsin. Each followed the same pattern: barbed wire perimeters, wooden barracks, watchtowers, and floodlights. Yet beyond those fences, America looked nothing like the ruin their propaganda had promised. The numbers grew quickly. By the end of 1944, over 371,000 German prisoners were held in the United States. Soldiers from North Africa, captured U-boat sailors, Luftwaffe personnel, and even Waffen-SS men. Most were between the ages of 18 and 30, veterans of distant campaigns who suddenly found themselves in the middle of a peaceful continent. The first nights were the hardest. Some expected beatings or starvation. Others waited for interrogations that never came. Instead, they were given bedding, hot meals, and medical checks. It was clean, one former POW later recalled. Too clean. We thought it must be a trick. For the U.S. Army, running these camps was not an act of kindness. It was an act of discipline. Obedience to the Geneva Convention was a moral weapon. By treating prisoners decently, America aimed to protect its own captured soldiers in Europe and demonstrate the strength of democratic order. Guards were instructed to maintain strict professionalism. No fraternizing, no cruelty, no revenge. Still, human curiosity slipped through the rules. Many guards were first- or second-generation German Americans who spoke their prisoners' language. They called them by name. They corrected their grammar. Some had family in the very towns the prisoners came from. That familiarity unsettled the Germans more than any punishment could. Night after night, behind the wire, German prisoners heard American radios, jazz, baseball, Roosevelt's voice. They began to understand that the enemy they'd been told was decadent and chaotic was in fact organized, powerful, and strangely generous. Yet this strange mercy did not mean freedom. The camps were tightly run. Each compound had its Lagerführer, or camp leader, elected from among the prisoners. The German chain of command, though broken, persisted within the wire. Hardline Nazis enforced discipline, sometimes with violence. Pro-Allied or apolitical men learned to keep quiet. And outside, America watched them with cautious curiosity. Civilians drove past in trucks and craned their necks at the tall fences. Farmers wondered if these same men had once shelled London or sunk Allied ships. For many Americans, the war felt suddenly real. Its soldiers and enemies no longer abstract. In that first winter of 1943, as snow fell over the barbed wire, the paradox of the POW experiment came into focus. A democracy hosting its sworn enemies, feeding them better than many of its allies, and following the rules even when no one else might have. It was the beginning of one of the most unlikely human chapters of the war, a story that would soon involve not just discipline and duty, but language, empathy, and moments of quiet grace in the most unthinkable of times. The camps would soon take on a life of their own, shaped not just by military necessity, but by the rhythms of the American home front that surrounded them. By early 1944, the POW program had grown into one of the largest and most complex logistical operations ever undertaken on U.S. soil. The Army Service Forces oversaw it with a precision that mirrored industrial efficiency. Camps were not just isolated barbed wire enclosures. They were self-contained towns, with hospitals, chapels, classrooms, mess halls, and command offices. Each facility followed a strict hierarchy. At the top stood the American commandant, beneath him American officers, and then a shadow structure, the internal German organization. The U.S. Army allowed this to exist for administrative stability, though it often reinforced old divisions between die-hard Nazis and men who simply wanted to survive the war in peace. The United States was vast, and the prisoners were scattered accordingly. Texas alone hosted more than 70 base and branch camps. The pine forests of Louisiana, the plains of Kansas, the sugar beet fields of Colorado, all became part of a hidden geography of captivity. The average American town was suddenly linked to a global conflict through a nearby fence line. The Geneva Convention required that POWs be housed in conditions similar to those of the detaining power's own soldiers. In practice, this meant solid barracks, heating where available, and adequate food. Rations mirrored those of American troops: meat, bread, vegetables, coffee, sometimes even dessert. In the later years of the war, when rationing tightened for civilians, it led to occasional resentment. Farmers and factory workers reading headlines that German prisoners eat better than we do. But the United States had its reasons. Every loaf of bread served in a POW camp was an argument for civilization. The War Department knew that every violation could be used against its own men in Europe or Japan. Obedience to law became a moral showcase, yet there was also pragmatism. America faced a severe labor shortage as millions of citizens joined the military or defense industries. The War Manpower Commission saw the POWs as a potential workforce, one that could legally be employed under Geneva Convention Article 27, provided they worked outside war-related industries and received fair compensation. By mid-1944, thousands of German prisoners were harvesting crops, cutting timber, repairing rail lines, and canning food for the civilian economy. They were paid in canteen coupons, scrip, that could be exchanged for toiletries, cigarettes, or small luxuries. Guards escorted them daily through town squares, fields, and factories. At first, local communities were uneasy. Rumors spread of escapees, sabotage, or Nazi propaganda infiltrating American neighborhoods. But reality proved calmer. Incidents of violence were rare. The greatest threat, as one Iowa sheriff put it, was that they worked too hard and made us look lazy. Human contact became inevitable. Farmers offered water on hot days. Some quietly shared meals. In a handful of cases, friendships formed that lasted decades after the war. The prisoners, many from bombed-out cities, were stunned by the abundance, by grocery stores full of fruit, by roads without checkpoints, by children playing unafraid. Inside the wire, American officers introduced education programs. The idea was not to indoctrinate but to occupy minds. Universities donated books. Volunteer professors lectured on history, literature, and economics. A few camps staged orchestras and theater productions. Goethe performed in Alabama, Beethoven in Kansas. For some Germans, this cultural freedom, allowed by their captors, was more shocking than the war itself. Still, not everything was calm. Ideological fault lines ran deep. At night, whispered threats circulated among barracks. Men who questioned Hitler risked assault by die-hard true believers. The U.S. Army began segregating radicals into special compounds, hoping to preserve order elsewhere. Meanwhile, American intelligence agencies were beginning to look closer at what the prisoners knew. Among the ranks were U-boat technicians, radar operators, scientists, and officers carrying the secrets of Germany's war machine. Their knowledge was valuable, but extracting it required patience, respect, and subtlety. The answer came not from torture, but from conversation. At a secluded facility in Virginia, known only by its postal address, P.O. Box 1142, the U.S. Military Intelligence Service built an interrogation center unlike any other. Prisoners were housed comfortably, spoken to in perfect German, offered newspapers, and sometimes treated to small luxuries, even chocolate. The goal was psychological trust. The results would astonish Washington. But across the country, most POWs knew nothing of these quiet interrogations. Their world remained defined by fences and routine, roll calls, work details, meals, letters censored and stamped, geprüft. And yet within that monotony, something was shifting. The humanity of their captors was slowly undermining years of propaganda. As 1944 drew to a close, the once terrifying enemy had become a country of contradictions, strict yet fair, victorious yet merciful, and within those contradictions, 6 distinct perspectives began to emerge, each revealing a different truth about captivity, character, and conscience in wartime America. Angle A, human and cultural. The language of respect. The first shock for many captured Germans was not chains, but words. When they stepped off the trains into American camps, some heard their own names spoken, not shouted, but pronounced with care. Guards with last names like Schneider, Bauer, or Weiss addressed them in fluent, precise German. Some were sons of immigrants, linguists from the Midwest who had grown up bilingual. It was a disarming experience. Nazi propaganda had painted America as a mongrel land of gangsters and chaos. Yet here were men who knew Goethe's poems and could recite Schiller. To be addressed as Herr Unteroffizier instead of Kraut was an unexpected form of disarmament, a courtesy that pierced through uniform and ideology alike. In many camps, culture became a bridge. Prisoners organized orchestras using instruments supplied by the YMCA. Others built elaborate nativity scenes from scrap wood. The most famous at Camp Algona, Iowa, still displayed every Christmas to this day. There were choirs, chess tournaments, art exhibitions. Some men wrote plays. Others carved wooden figurines they would later send home. Music carried the strongest emotional charge. American guards would pause their rounds to listen as the strains of Bach or Schubert floated from the barracks. In return, the POWs heard country music and swing for the first time. That exchange of melodies, old Europe meeting new America, softened the hard edges of captivity. Mail and parcels provided another link to humanity. The International Red Cross delivered letters from home, each one censored but treasured. Family photos pinned above bunks became reminders that even in enemy hands, life went on. For many, those snapshots were the first time they smiled in months. These were small mercies. But in war, small mercies echo loudest. And for a generation raised under dictatorship, such decency was as shocking as any defeat. Angle B, legal and ethical. The law as a weapon of moral warfare. From Washington's perspective, the humane treatment of prisoners was not merely charity, it was strategy. The Geneva Convention of 1929, signed reluctantly by Germany but scrupulously obeyed by the U.S., became the framework for moral contrast. American officials knew that how they treated their captives would be closely watched by their own citizens, by neutral nations, and by the enemy's propaganda machine. Each camp underwent regular inspection by the International Committee of the Red Cross. Reports praised the organization, sanitation, and access to medical care. Even the smallest infractions, such as delayed mail or overcrowded bunks, were documented and corrected. But the deeper purpose was psychological. The War Department wanted the world to see that democracy could fight ruthlessly without becoming cruel. It was a deliberate message to both enemies and allies. Our strength lies in restraint. At the same time, not every American agreed. Editorials occasionally questioned why Hitler's men should be eating steak, while soldiers' families queued for rationed meat. Congressmen received letters demanding harsher conditions. Yet the Army stood firm. General Brehon Somervell, who oversaw the service forces, declared that discipline in treatment was discipline in principle. The rules extended even to punishment. When prisoners violated camp orders, they were not beaten. They were tried in formal hearings and sentenced to confinement or reduced rations, all in accordance with the law. To many Germans, it was an alien experience, the state respecting the rights of its enemy. This meticulous legality would later prove more powerful than any leaflet. It revealed to thousands of POWs that America's strength did not depend on terror, and in the minds of many, that realization began eroding years of indoctrination about barbaric democracies. Angle C. Labor and economy. The enemy as a workforce. As the war dragged on, labor became one of the defining realities of captivity. By 1944, American farms and factories were struggling to fill positions left vacant by men fighting overseas. The solution came behind barbed wire. Under Geneva Convention regulations, POWs could be employed in non-military labor, paid, insured, and supervised. Soon, German prisoners were scattered across the countryside in small detachments called branch camps. In Alabama, they harvested peanuts and cotton. In Minnesota, they cut timber through bitter winters. In California, they picked fruit under the hot Central Valley sun. For many, it was the first time they worked shoulder to shoulder with civilians, not under orders, but under contract. Local farmers were astonished by their discipline and efficiency. Some Americans even began to feel sympathy. "They're boys like ours," one Arkansas woman told a reporter. Work transformed the prisoners' daily existence. Outside the wire, they saw the prosperity of the very country their leaders had mocked. There was no Gestapo, no air raid sirens, no fear of the police. Payment was modest. Canteen coupons, not cash, but it allowed them to buy shaving cream, tobacco, or the occasional chocolate bar. Freedom of choice, even in miniature, was intoxicating. The relationships that formed were cautiously respectful. Farmers would sometimes slip the workers sandwiches or coffee. Guards looked the other way. When harvests ended, many towns sent farewell letters or gifts. After the war, some former POWs even returned as immigrants, drawn by the memory of fair treatment. Yet labor also revealed contradictions. The same men who once marched under the swastika were now fueling the economy of their enemy, an irony not lost on them. Some felt humiliation. Others saw it as redemption. And for the United States, the system was both practical and symbolic, proof that even war's destruction could feed life again. But behind these visible routines, the music, the fairness, the labor, another quieter campaign was unfolding, one that sought not just to contain Germany's soldiers, but to understand them. Angle D. Intelligence and counterintelligence. The quiet war behind the wire. While most German prisoners chopped wood or harvested crops, a select few found themselves in a very different world, one of polished floors, cordial interrogators, and invisible microphones. Hidden behind the modest mailing address, P.O. Box 1142, near Alexandria, Virginia, stood one of America's most secret wartime installations. Officially, it did not exist. Inside, U.S. Army and Navy intelligence officers, many of them German-speaking émigrés, carried out psychological warfare that relied not on force, but finesse. Here, captured U-boat officers, V-2 rocket engineers, and senior staff from the Wehrmacht were housed in comfort. They were never tortured. Instead, they were lulled into conversation. German newspapers arrived daily. Meals were generous. Guards treated them with disarming respect. What the prisoners didn't know was that every word was recorded, in bedrooms, gardens, even toilets, through hidden microphones. The transcripts later revealed everything from radar frequencies to torpedo defects. One careless remark by a captured submarine officer exposed the locations of German supply routes in the Atlantic. Another conversation between engineers helped Allied scientists predict V-2 capabilities before the rockets struck London. The intelligence yield from 1142 was extraordinary, but the real victory lay in method. America proved that information could be extracted through civility and intellect, not brutality. It was a lesson that haunted captured Germans, many of whom had believed their enemies were no better than themselves. Elsewhere, similar listening posts operated within ordinary camps. Prisoners who boasted too freely about secret weapons or atrocities found themselves quietly separated for reclassification, the invisible war of words, waged with politeness, was one of the most effective intelligence campaigns of the entire conflict. Angle. E. Security and incidents. When the fences were tested for all the order and decency, the POW system was not immune to tension. Ideology, pride, and boredom sometimes ignited violence within the wire. In several camps, hardline Nazis enforced discipline through intimidation, targeting anyone suspected of defeatism or sympathy toward the Allies. At Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma in 1943, a prisoner named Johannes Kunze was beaten to death by his fellow inmates after being accused of collaboration. The murder led to the execution of 5 German prisoners by U.S. authorities, a rare and grim reminder that beneath the civility lay lethal conviction. The most famous breach came a year later in Arizona. On the night of December 23, 1944, 25 German officers escaped from Camp Papago Park through a hand-dug tunnel stretching nearly 200 feet under the desert. They emerged under a full moon, armed with stolen maps and homemade compasses, dreaming of crossing to Mexico. For a week, the desert swallowed them, until rain, cold, and hunger forced them back. One was found trying to float down a canal on a stolen raft made of scrap wood and tin cans. The episode became a local legend, half farce, half epic. Newspapers called it the Great Escape of the Desert. Yet the prisoners were treated humanely even after capture. No reprisals followed, only curiosity. "You've done a fine engineering job," one American officer reportedly told the tunnel leader. Such incidents underscored the strange coexistence of two truths: that America could fight ruthlessly abroad while maintaining moral restraint at home. Even when its enemies defied the rules, the Guards stood by them. Still, the war's end was approaching, and both sides knew the balance of power had shifted. Camp radios buzzed with Allied victories: Rome, Paris, Aachen, the Rhine. For many prisoners, the question was no longer if Germany would lose, but what would remain when it did. Angle F. Re-education and information. Warfare. Turning minds, not just battles. In 1944, the U.S. Army's Psychological Warfare Division launched one of its most unusual programs, re-education. Officially known as the Special Projects Division, its mission was to prepare captured Germans for a democratic future, without violating the Geneva Convention's ban on political indoctrination. It began subtly. Camps received new reading material, carefully selected newspapers, translated essays, and reprinted classics banned by the Nazis. A weekly German-language magazine, Der Ruf, The Call, was distributed among prisoners. Written by anti-Nazi intellectuals and German émigrés, it featured articles on literature, history, and moral responsibility. Its tone was not propaganda, but reflection. What will Germany be when the war is over? Lecture programs followed. Visiting professors spoke on democracy, law, and ethics. Film nights screened documentaries about the American Constitution or the liberation of occupied nations. At first, attendance was voluntary and sparse, but curiosity grew as the Third Reich's defeats mounted. The challenge was enormous. Many POWs had been indoctrinated since youth. Some refused to read anything not approved by Berlin. Others, however, began to question. The revelation of Nazi atrocities, especially after reports from liberated camps, shook even the most loyal. "We thought we were the civilized ones," a former Luftwaffe officer later wrote. "In America, I began to see what civilization actually meant." The re-education experiment was imperfect, uneven, and sometimes resented, but its long-term impact was profound. Many of the prisoners who read Der Ruf later became advocates for democracy in post-war West Germany. Writers, teachers, and politicians who carried memories of their captivity as a strange education in freedom. By early 1945, as news of Germany's collapse filtered through camp radios, that education would collide with reality. The war was ending, and for tens of thousands of men behind American fences, the hardest lesson was yet to come. Winter, 1944, the year when illusion finally shattered. Outside the barbed wire, the Battle of the Bulge raged across the Ardennes. Inside the American camps, snow fell softly on roofs built by enemy hands. The war's thunder reached them only through radio static. Fragments of broadcasts, coded bulletins, rumors passed from bunk to bunk. The 1,000-year Reich was cracking, and the prisoners felt the tremors even in Kansas, Georgia, or Oregon. By this time, most of them had lived under American custody for more than a year. The routines were fixed: dawn roll call, breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, work details, mail inspection, lights out. Yet something intangible had changed. The hostility had drained away. Suspicion had turned into quiet observation, and then into reluctant admiration. In one Illinois camp, a farmer poured coffee into tin cups for a group of German workers. They sat together on overturned crates, steam curling from their mugs. "You fight hard," the farmer told them, "but you work harder." No one answered, but a few of the men smiled, awkwardly, unsure if they were allowed to. In another camp, a Red Cross parcel arrived with a small packet of Swiss chocolate. The commandant divided it evenly, 1 square per man. The taste, foreign and sweet, struck something deep. To men raised in scarcity and propaganda, it felt like an impossible gesture, one that said, without words, "You are still human." Moments like these were spreading quietly across the continent. In the sawmills of Maine, in the canneries of California, and in the beet fields of the Midwest, German prisoners encountered not hatred, but fairness. They saw towns unscarred by bombs, schools open, black and white children playing side by side. They noticed that guards joked with officers, that civilians questioned authority without fear. The ideological armor began to crack. "If this is democracy," one former Panzer sergeant recalled, "then we were lied to all our lives." In some camps, prisoners began holding their own discussion circles, cautiously at first, then openly. They debated the news, compared memories, analyzed speeches by Hitler and Roosevelt. When American officers arranged screenings of newsreels showing the liberation of Paris or the advance into Germany, silence filled the barracks. The Reich they had been told was invincible now looked brittle and desperate. For others, the turning point came not from politics, but from small acts of compassion. A guard mailing a prisoner's letter after hours, a camp doctor treating frostbite with care, a local child waving at a work detail through a school fence. One evening in late 1944, at a camp near Fort Custer, Michigan, a group of prisoners asked their guard to join them for Christmas carols. He hesitated. Regulations forbade fraternization, but then quietly stepped inside. As Stille Nacht filled the room, both prisoners and guard found themselves blinking away tears. The guard's name was O'Donnell. One of the prisoners, a former Wehrmacht chaplain, later wrote to his family, "Even in captivity, we learned the meaning of mercy. Yet mercy did not erase guilt." As the Allies uncovered concentration camps in Europe, Reports reached the United States. Photos appeared in newspapers. Smuggled clippings circulated through the camps. Many refused to believe them, until confirmation arrived from German radio itself. That knowledge broke something far deeper than military pride. Some wept openly. Others sat in stunned silence. The myth of a noble Reich was gone, replaced by a void no one knew how to fill. By early 1945, the fences felt less like punishment and more like protection, a place where defeated soldiers could think without fear of the Gestapo, without orders, without slogans. The camps became islands of reflection in a collapsing world. Letters home grew more honest. "We have food and work here," wrote one. "Do not believe everything the party says. The Americans treat us fairly." To U.S. officers, those letters were small victories in a moral war. To the prisoners, they were confessions, fragments of truth mailed back into ruins. Outside the wire, America was changing too. Guards who had arrived hardened by loss now saw their prisoners differently. Some no longer called them enemies, but the boys. They had watched them labor through heat, snow, and homesickness without complaint. They had seen them break down at the news of a brother killed in Russia. The war that divided continents was, in these quiet enclosures, dissolving into something more human, a shared exhaustion, a shared understanding of loss. And as winter began to lift, a strange, collective realization spread. The war might end soon, but captivity would linger longer than anyone expected. The end was coming, not with gunfire, but with silence, surrender, and the sound of a radio announcing Germany's collapse. Spring 1945. The day the radio fell silent. It began in fragments. Prisoners leaning close to static-filled camp receivers caught phrases in German. Berlin encircled. Führer headquarters. Unconditional surrender imminent. For hours, rumor churned faster than truth. Then, on May 8th, the loudspeakers crackled with the official announcement: Germany had capitulated. The war in Europe was over. In Camp Clinton, Mississippi, a sergeant stood outside the barracks with his helmet in his hands. Around him, hundreds of men stared at the ground. Some cried openly, others clenched their fists, still unable to believe that 12 years of struggle had ended in a single sentence. The guard on duty removed his cap and waited in silence. The same scene repeated across the country. In Colorado, Oklahoma, Illinois, and Maine. The floodlights dimmed that night, and for the first time, no one ordered the prisoners back inside. Some prayed aloud. Others sang hymns in low voices. The victory belonged to their captors, yet even the Americans did not celebrate loudly. They understood that for these men, the news was not peace, but collapse. For the prisoners, the next days were confusion made tangible. The swastika patches were cut from uniforms. Portraits of Hitler were quietly burned in stoves. Propaganda officers, once the loudest voices in the camps, now hid their armbands and begged for forgiveness. In one camp, the leader of a Nazi faction asked to speak to the commandant. When told the war was over, he simply said, "Then perhaps we can start living." Mail from home brought devastation. Many families were gone. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden were piles of ash. Men who had boasted of their hometowns now whispered their names like elegies. The country they were supposed to return to no longer existed. The American guards noticed the change immediately. The swagger vanished. The nightly singing of marching songs faded into silence. Yet something else appeared: humility. When the camp chaplain read from the Book of Psalms, more men attended than ever before. The U.S. Army, unsure how long the prisoners would remain, began easing restrictions. Fences stayed up, but gates opened more freely. Educational programs expanded. Debates were encouraged. The re-education officers found their audiences suddenly attentive. Classes in democracy, ethics, and world history filled quickly. "We wanted to understand the world we had destroyed," one prisoner later said. Among the most striking moments came at Camp Aliceville, Alabama. There, in May 1945, prisoners volunteered to perform Beethoven's Ode to Joy in honor of peace. When the final notes faded, the American officers stood and applauded, not as victors, but as witnesses to shared humanity. A captured Luftwaffe musician wrote in his diary, "For 1 hour there were no fences." But peace also brought uncertainty. Rumors of transfer to Britain or France spread, to labor camps helping rebuild the ruins of Europe. Others feared revenge or starvation upon return. Some begged to remain in America, offering to work as farmers, mechanics, or translators. Their captors could only shake their heads. The law required eventual repatriation. As summer arrived, the camps entered a strange limbo. The war was over, yet the fences still stood. American soldiers waiting for discharge played baseball beyond the wire, watched by men who had once fought to destroy them. In quiet corners they traded cigarettes, songs, and stories. At Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, an American lieutenant named Harold Myers struck up nightly conversations with a former Wehrmacht engineer, Heinrich Vollmer. They spoke about machinery, philosophy, and the future of Europe. When Vollmer was finally repatriated months later, he left a note. "You showed me what strength without hatred looks like. I will not forget. Not every story ended so peacefully." Some prisoners, tormented by guilt or fear of returning to Soviet-occupied zones, took their own lives. Others turned bitter, believing they had been betrayed by their generals and deceived by their leaders. For them, captivity had outlasted surrender. But for the majority, something fundamental had changed. The myth of invincible Germany had been replaced by a new awareness that power could exist without cruelty, that discipline could coexist with compassion. Many wrote later that their first lessons in democracy came not from books, but from how the Americans treated them after defeat. On the evening of VE Day, the lights in many camps stayed on late. Guards and prisoners alike lingered near the fences, talking in quiet tones. One American sergeant passed cigarettes through the wire. A German corporal accepted them, then hesitated, and offered back a small wooden carving he had made in the workshop. An eagle, wings folded, carved from a piece of pine. The exchange was simple, wordless, and final. The next morning, the American flag still flew above the compound, but it no longer felt like a symbol of triumph. It felt like a promise that even in victory, restraint could preserve humanity. In the months that followed, trains would roll east and ships would sail home. But for many who lived behind the wire, America would remain the place where they first saw their enemy as human. Summer 1945. The world was quiet again, but the fences still stood. When victory was declared in Europe, most Americans assumed the POWs would be sent home within weeks. Instead, the process unfolded slowly, tangled in politics, logistics, and the grim arithmetic of rebuilding a shattered continent. The United States now held more than 370,000 German prisoners, a population larger than many American cities. Ships were scarce, ports crowded, and Europe's infrastructure lay in ruins. The War Department decided to repatriate the men gradually, according to need and security. Some would go first to Britain or France for labor duties before finally returning to Germany. In official memos, it was described as redeployment. For the men behind the wire, it felt like purgatory. During those long months of waiting, camp life entered a strange twilight. There were no more alerts, no more propaganda speeches, no more expectations of rescue. Guards and prisoners alike lived in an uneasy peace, bound by habit more than hostility. Baseball games continued, classes expanded, and church services grew crowded. Letters from Germany arrived sporadically. The words were short, censored, often tragic. "Our house gone," wrote one mother. "Father dead. Little Liesel safe." The letters smelled faintly of smoke and sea salt, relics from a continent buried under rubble. The War Department faced new challenges. How to sustain morale in men with no future inside the wire? How to prevent despair from turning to violence? The answer came, paradoxically, through freedom. By mid-1945, the Army introduced honor systems in many camps. Fences were lowered, roll calls relaxed. Groups of trusted prisoners were allowed to walk unguarded to work details or local errands. Escapes almost never occurred. The men had nowhere to run and no desire to. America had become their only refuge from chaos. The psychological transformation was striking. Where once there had been fear and defiance, now there was cooperation. Former officers gave lectures on reconstruction and democracy. In several camps, German POWs began voluntarily writing essays about what had gone wrong in their homeland, reflections that would later appear in post-war newspapers across Europe. Repatriation began in phases. The first ships left New York and New Orleans in the autumn of 1945. Men stood on deck watching the Statue of Liberty recede into the fog, uncertain whether they were leaving captivity or home. Some wept. Others sang softly, not the martial hymns of the Reich, but folk songs from their villages. For the Americans, the departures were bittersweet. Many guards had grown attached to the men they once called enemies. At Camp Aliceville, locals brought gifts to the departing trains: apples, scarves, small notes of farewell. One Alabama woman handed a departing POW a loaf of bread and said simply, "You'll need this where you're going." As the transports dwindled, the camps themselves began to empty. Barracks were dismantled, watchtowers removed, the land sold back to farmers. By the spring of 1946, most major compounds had closed. Only a few remained, holding the last contingents waiting for European transfer. In the official statistics, the American POW program ended as one of the most successful in history. Fewer than 1% of the prisoners died in U.S. custody, most from illness or accidents. No mass executions, no starvation, no retaliation. In the ruins of post-war Europe, such numbers would seem almost miraculous, but the true legacy was less visible. For thousands of Germans, those years behind American fences became a moral crossroads, a place where defeat turned into reflection, and reflection into renewal. One former prisoner wrote decades later, "We came to America as soldiers. We left as men." Yet the story did not end when the ships sailed. What awaited them in the ruins of Germany, and what memories they carried home, would shape a new chapter in the strange friendship between former enemies. Germany, 1946, a nation in ashes. The trains that carried the returning prisoners rolled through landscapes almost unrecognizable. Once proud cities were skeletal, twisted steel, blackened bricks, and hollow windows staring into voids where streets had been. The men stared silently through the grime-streaked glass, searching for landmarks that no longer existed. When they disembarked, many were met not by families, but by silence. Some were greeted by mothers in tattered coats clutching ration cards. Others found only the ruins of their homes. The shock of peace was often worse than the shock of war. The transition from American order to German chaos was brutal. The POWs, once well-fed and housed, now queued for watery soup in bombed-out canteens. The moral contrast was impossible to ignore. They had left abundance, steady meals, warm clothing, the strange decency of their captors, and returned to hunger, rubble, and uncertainty. Yet for many, those contrasts became a strange form of strength. In the camps of America, they had learned routines of fairness and cooperation that were now invaluable in rebuilding their homeland. They understood the discipline of rules, the idea of accountability, and, above all, the possibility of dignity without tyranny. Letters began to travel back across the Atlantic, from the ruins to the guards, farmers and families they had once worked beside. Some thanked them for kindness, others asked for news of the America they had left behind. A few even enclosed tokens, a carved figure, a painted postcard, a faded photograph of the camp orchestra. A surprising number of ex-POWs applied to emigrate to the United States in the following years. The Immigration Act made it difficult but not impossible. By the 1950s, thousands of former prisoners had returned, as immigrants, laborers, or scholars, building new lives in the country that had once held them captive. Historians would later trace an unexpected lineage. Many of those who participated in the Special Projects Division and read Der Ruf in captivity went on to become part of West Germany's democratic revival. Among them were journalists, teachers, and even politicians who helped shape the post-war republic. They called themselves Die Nachdenklichen, the reflective ones. Their education in democracy, they said, had begun not in a classroom, but behind barbed wire in the American Midwest. Even in families who never left Europe, the memory of that captivity endured. Children grew up hearing about the fair guards, the endless fields, the small chocolate square. The war stories of bitterness and destruction often ended with that same strange note of gratitude. For the United States, the legacy was equally complex. The POW program became a quiet proof of concept that humanity could be a strategic asset. It showed that moral conduct, far from weakness, could yield dividends measured not just in intelligence or propaganda, but in the rebuilding of nations. American communities that had once feared the enemy later looked back with pride. Many of the campsites became farms again, their soil enriched not just by labor, but by history. At Algona, Iowa, the nativity scene built by German hands still stands each Christmas, a wooden reminder of compassion in wartime. At Papago Park, Arizona, the desert tunnel remains preserved as a curiosity, a monument not to escape, but to ingenuity and restraint. The men who once dug it went home long ago, some to the east, others to the west, but many carried a fragment of America within them, an idea of fairness that would outlast propaganda and defeat. By 1948, almost all German prisoners had been repatriated. The barbed wire was gone, the barracks dismantled. What remained were memories, letters, and lessons. One former prisoner summed it simply: "They called us by name. They treated us as men. And that, more than victory, is what broke us." In that quiet recognition, in the mercy shown between enemies, lay the foundation for a new world that was already beginning to form. In the end, the story of the German POWs in America is not one of conquest, but of conscience. It is the rare chapter of war where power met mercy, and mercy prevailed. When the gates finally opened and the prisoners walked free, they carried more than duffel bags and discharge papers. They carried a revelation that strength need not mean cruelty, and that even in war, humanity could be disciplined, deliberate, and exact. The small gestures endured longest: a name spoken correctly, a square of chocolate shared in silence, a guard who refused to hate. These fragments of decency, scattered across thousands of miles of barbed wire, outlived the empires and ideologies that had once demanded obedience. History would remember the great battles: Normandy, Stalingrad, Berlin. But in the quiet spaces between them, another war had been fought. The struggle to remain human when everything around urged otherwise. America, for all its flaws, proved that democracy could hold its moral line even when tested by vengeance and victory. In the decades that followed, those lessons rippled outward. Former POWs helped rebuild a democratic Germany, guided by the memory of fairness they had once received from their captors. American guards grew old telling their children that compassion, not hatred, was what won the peace. The fences are long gone now. Grass covers the old campgrounds. Plows turn the soil where sentries once stood. But sometimes, when winter comes and snow begins to fall, it's not hard to imagine that moment again. A young guard in a heavy coat, a prisoner blinking against the cold, a simple gift exchanged across a line of wire, a voice calling out in clear, perfect German. Feldwebel Hans Kruger, and a man who had lost everything realizing, for the first time in years, that he was still seen. That was the quiet victory, not written in treaties or parades, but in the hearts of those who discovered that the surest sign of civilization is not how fiercely we fight, but how gently we treat the defeated.